Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the shadowed valleys of Colombia, where the air smells of earth and gunpowder, and the trees remember names the law forgot. It's the 2000s, and somewhere beyond the sugarcane and fog, a man named Carlos Castaño Gil is reshaping violence into doctrine, bullets into boundaries. This isn't a tale of a gangster in a loud suit. This is the story of a paramilitary don who claimed a cause, even as he waded through blood to chase it. You probably won't survive this one, not because of the gunfire, but because the moral gray will melt your compass. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where these quiet stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Carlos Castaño is born into the trembling heart of Colombia's countryside, 1965, in the department of Antioquia. At first glance, he's just another rancher's son, mud on his boots, calluses on his hands, the kind of boy who names his dogs after saints and knows how to skin a rabbit before learning his multiplication tables. But Antioquia isn't just hills and horses. It's also a crucible of war. Marxist guerrilla groups roam the hills. Kidnappings are a business model. His home becomes a war zone not marked on any map. He grows up watching men disappear. One day, it's a neighbor. Another day, it's a cousin. Then, one dusk, it's his father, kidnapped by the FARC and never returned. That's the night Carlos stops being a boy. Do you remember the day he left with the first money? That was the beginning, when he traded grief for grit and inheritance for ammunition. Many people still think that Carlos Castaño was just another narco in a patriot's clothing. So what do you think? Was he seeking justice or building a cartel under the banner of redemption? The truth lies somewhere between the barrel of a rifle and the breath of a prayer. Because when Carlos decides to fight back, he doesn't join the army or flee to the cities. He starts sketching the outlines of a new militia, one that will one day command more than 11,000 men, and whose cause would terrify even the criminals. The fields where he once herded cattle will soon become staging grounds, and the boy who buried his father's memory will become the most feared paramilitary commander in Colombia. Tonight, we begin walking that road with him, step by brutal step. The soil in Antioquia is red and thick, clay that stains your boots and holds the past like a confession. Carlos walks across it every morning before dawn, the fog still clinging to the hills like a warning. By the time he's 12, he's already figured out the two most important truths of his world. The law doesn't reach these parts, and your last name better carry more weight than your wallet. For Carlos, the Castaño name is becoming both shield and target. His family is large, close-knit, and hard. Cattle ranchers, horsemen, and merchants. The Castaños carve out a living through sheer will and calloused palms. But life is turning more complicated. Guerrilla factions like the FARC and ELN aren't just political slogans on radio broadcasts. They're men in fatigues who show up in the night asking questions you don't want to answer wrong. They burn fields, take hostages, and call it revolution. Everyone in the valley has a story. Carlos is collecting his. The one that breaks him? His father's disappearance. Jesus Castaño is kidnapped while tending to his land. No trial, no warning, no return. The ransom negotiations go nowhere. Days turn into weeks. Then silence. And in that silence, something in Carlos calcifies. Information closest to him suggests that from the moment his father's voice vanishes from the earth, Carlos stops trusting diplomacy. He starts studying rifles. He and his brothers, Fidel and Vicente, tighten their bonds. Fidel is older, sterner. Vicente is quieter, but observant. Together, they begin crafting a new idea. What if defense doesn't wait for permission? What if the people forgotten by Bogota defend themselves? Many people still think that Colombia's paramilitaries were just tools of the oligarchy. So what do you think? Because here in the highlands, boys with scars are starting to believe that bullets speak louder than ballots. Carlos doesn't dream of politics. He dreams of patrol routes and safe zones. At 15, most kids are worrying about their school grades. He's sketching ambush positions in his notebook margins. In secret, the Castaño brothers begin networking with ranchers, ex-military, and displaced peasants. They don't call it an army yet, but it smells like one. They hold night meetings, test weapons in forest clearings, and whisper about vengeance. Carlos absorbs it all with the fervor of a disciple and the cold arithmetic of a tactician. He's still young, but his demeanor's shifting. There's less laughter in his voice now. He walks slower, listens more. He watches how people flinch when trucks roll into town. He catalogs their fear like a researcher, trying to understand the ecosystem of terror so he can flip it on its head. At family gatherings, he speaks less and drinks more. But when he talks, people lean in. There's gravity building around him, and no one knows yet whether it's the kind that draws you in or swallows you whole. Years from now, people will ask, when did Carlos Castaño become dangerous? The answer isn't a single date. It's this era, the slow layering of grief, strategy, and fury. When a teenager begins thinking like a colonel and no one stops him, by the time most young men are picking between college or trade work, Carlos Castaño is picking targets. The mountains he once rode through on horseback with his brothers are now carefully mapped with choke points, observation zones, and fallback routes. Every bend in the trail, every farmer's fence line, it's all part of a battlefield he's learning to control. It doesn't happen overnight, of course. The evolution from grieving son to paramilitary commander is quiet, methodical, and, at times, almost invisible. But those who pay attention, those who remember the boy who used to sing during cattle drives, can feel the change. There's a stillness to Carlos now, a patience that unnerves. His voice stays calm even when others shout. His eyes track everything, people, patterns, terrain. It's not charisma, it's calculation. The first real formation of his vision comes through a local militia effort. Small, loosely organized groups of ranchers and self-defense volunteers. These aren't hardened soldiers. They're scared civilians with bolt-action rifles, farming tools, and vendettas. But they have something guerrillas underestimate: local knowledge and nothing left to lose. Carlos begins training them, leading maneuvers, creating a rhythm to their defense. They stop reacting and start anticipating. Information closest to Carlos suggests that he spends entire nights walking perimeters alone, counting seconds between patrols, listening to the forest breathe. When he speaks to his men, it's not with passion, but with plans. He's not trying to inspire them. He's trying to win. And yet, there's a strange paradox. The deeper he gets into this shadow war, the more he convinces himself he's doing it for peace. Not just for revenge, but for order. It's a theme that will haunt him later. This idea that violence, if managed and structured, can be moral. The kind of logic that lets you sleep at night, even when you've buried too many. Many people still think that the early paramilitary cells were spontaneous acts of resistance. But so what do you think? Could anything that disciplined, that coordinated, really be improvised? Or were men like Carlos already designing something larger, more sinister? What's certain is this. The man who once wept over his father's empty chair is now briefing locals on ambush tactics. He talks about body positions, signal flares, fallback routes. He draws the first crude logo of what would become the AUC, 3 letters that will one day strike fear across the hemisphere. But here, in this dusty barn outside Apartado, it's just a sketch on a piece of plywood, lit by a single flickering lantern. Carlos grows into his command, slowly but firmly. His older brother Fidel plays a key role, bringing in resources, networking with ranching elites and anti-communist politicians. They aren't talking about a militia anymore. They're talking about an army, a counterbalance to the FARC, a force that will not only resist but erase. One rainy afternoon, a convoy of guerrillas attempts a kidnapping just outside the village. Carlos and his men intercept them. The battle is short, brutal. For the first time, his name circulates not in whispers, but in radio static. Survivors say the ambush was surgical, like a military unit had struck. But there's no insignia, no official acknowledgement. Just scorched brush, brass casings, and a silence that buzzes with new tension. He doesn't gloat. He studies, reviews mistakes, adjusts patrol grids. More volunteers show up. The ranks swell. The tactics sharpen. And while the Colombian government watches from afar, distracted by its own dysfunction, a new empire of shadows is taking root in the foothills, led by a man who no longer doubts what he's becoming. The foothills begin to hum with a different kind of energy. Not the chaos of guerrilla raids, but the thrum of something tighter, more disciplined. Uniforms are still mismatched, weapons still a patchwork of whatever can be acquired. But the men now move like units. They respond to hand signals, rotate shifts, clean their gear without being told. Something is shifting beneath the soil of rural Colombia, and Carlos Castaño is at the center of it. Early clashes with guerrillas are swift, often crude, but effective. Hit-and-run ambushes on known FARC checkpoints, midnight raids on safe houses. Carlos favors precision over spectacle. He rarely overcommits. His philosophy is simple: control territory by making chaos expensive. And for the guerrillas, chaos is starting to cost dearly. He learns to study guerrilla patterns, their rest days, supply routes, even how they respond to certain provocations. He probes, tests, withdraws. His men call it hunting the phantoms. And though they lack formal training, their intimate knowledge of the terrain and Carlos's methodical mind makes them lethal. One of his commanders later says, "Carlos didn't lead from the front. He led from the shadows, and that made him harder to stop." Information closest to Carlos from this period suggests he becomes obsessed with maintaining secrecy. Meetings are held in caves, farms, churches. He burns maps after use. He cross-checks loyalty constantly, even among his own brothers. What began as a mission of defense is becoming a game of networks, alliances, and long-term strategy. In these early years, Carlos also begins forging the first real coalitions, not just with local militias, but with regional landowners and businessmen who are tired of guerrilla extortion. These people don't love violence, but they hate instability more. If Carlos can promise them a perimeter, they'll fund his army. Trucks full of supplies begin arriving under the cover of night: boots, radios, ammunition, sometimes even trainers, retired military men looking for a purpose, or maybe just a paycheck. This is the moment when Carlos begins to feel power, not just influence, but control. The ability to shape an entire village's day-to-day life through force or favor. The paramilitary presence grows like a root system, quiet, tangled, hard to trace. Local leaders begin consulting with his lieutenants. Teachers stop mentioning certain topics. Guerrilla graffiti gets painted over faster than it goes up. Many people still think that these early alliances were purely tactical, but so what do you think? Was Carlos truly aiming for security and order? Or was he just refining a more politically palatable version of warlordism? One night, a small town near Cordoba throws a party. It's public, patriotic, and suspiciously well-funded. A dozen men in camouflage blend into the crowd. They're not drinking. They're watching. Carlos isn't there, but his presence is. The music stops when a stranger asks the wrong questions. The man disappears. People say nothing. Carlos is building more than an army. He's building myth. Stories begin circulating of how he spares the innocent, punishes the corrupt, protects farmers. But others whisper darker tales of disappearances, of messages carved into doors, of families forced to flee without a word. In one documented case, a village once loyal to the guerrillas flips overnight. The change isn't subtle. New flags, new rules, new eyes on every corner. No one admits what happened, but the message is clear. Carlos Castaño's reach now extends farther than a rifle shot. He doesn't claim territory with banners, he claims it with silence. And in rural Colombia, silence means control. Carlos Castaño stands at a strange crossroads, his boots sunk in the mud of rural Colombia, but his thoughts drifting toward political theory. He reads more now. Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, and old Colombian history books filled with dust and blood. His nights are split between planning raids and writing manifestos, and somewhere between the shootouts and strategy sessions, he begins to believe something dangerous, that this isn't just war, it's a cause. He starts calling his campaign a social defense project. To outsiders, it sounds like PR spin, a narco-trafficker trying to whitewash the bullet holes. But to Carlos, it feels real. He tells his men they are patriots, that the state has failed, and that they are stepping into the vacuum, not to conquer, but to clean. It's the kind of story that sits easier in the soul, especially when the killing gets messy. And it does get messy. Villages suspected of harboring guerrilla collaborators face purges. Some are warned, some aren't. The rules are simple. Don't feed them. Don't talk to them. Don't look the other way. But in places where allegiance is survival, these commands become impossible puzzles. People vanish. Entire families sometimes. Roads once patrolled by guerrillas now echo with the boots of Carlos's men. Many people still think that these acts were necessary in wartime. Surgical even. But so what do you think? When a man uses terror to fight terror, is he cleaning the house or just painting over the blood? Carlos knows what the press will say. So, he gets ahead of it. He begins shaping his public persona. Quiet, serious, principled. He avoids flashy interviews but grants the occasional written statement. In them, he denounces guerrilla kidnappings, drug trafficking, and corruption. He calls for order, tradition, and Christian values. It's not entirely false, but it's not entirely true either. Information closest to Carlos during this time reveals he's conflicted. He genuinely wants a more stable Colombia, but he also enjoys command, The respect, the fear, the way people straighten their backs when he walks in. It's addictive, that kind of gravity. His men begin adopting his language. They speak of their mission as noble. They sing patriotic songs before missions. Some even carry rosaries. They're not just paramilitaries now. They're an army of ideals, or so they tell themselves. One chilling example comes from a village called Nueva Esperanza. It's caught between FARC extortion and paramilitary patrols. The locals try to stay neutral. One Sunday morning, the church bells ring late. A note appears nailed to the wooden door. Pick a side, soon. A week later, several community leaders disappear. By the end of the month, the town pledges allegiance to Carlos's forces. No resistance, no questions, just flags and curfews and silence. Back in headquarters, Carlos sits at a wooden table surrounded by maps. His radio hums with intercepted messages. He circles towns in red. His commanders come and go, offering updates, casualties, rumors. He listens carefully, asks questions others wouldn't think to ask. Then, once they leave, he writes in a leather notebook. Plans, reflections, quotations. Sometimes, even poetry. There's a moment when a young fighter brings him a copy of El Espectador, one of Colombia's major newspapers. The headline labels his group a growing threat to democracy. Carlos reads it in silence, then folds the paper carefully and places it in a drawer. If they call us a threat, he says quietly. Then they've started listening. This is the paradox of Carlos Castaño, a man who sees himself as a savior while acting like a shadow. He believes his mission is righteous, even when it drips with menace. His followers call him El Comandante. His enemies call him worse. But in every corner of rural Colombia, one truth becomes impossible to deny. Carlos isn't just fighting a war. He's branding it. The bond between Carlos and his brothers, Fidel and Vigilante, is less of sentiment and more of circuitry. They operate like a system. Fidel, the financier and founding fire starter. Vigilante, the quiet administrator of territory and logistics. And Carlos, the face and philosopher, blending firepower with ideology. Together, they're not just a family. They're the hard drive of an emerging paramilitary empire. Fidel Castaño, the eldest, is already known in certain circles long before Carlos steps into prominence. He's had dealings with Medellin cartel lieutenants and is no stranger to the drug corridors that snake through Antioquia. Information closest to Carlos suggests he always looked up to Fidel, not just for his fearlessness, but for the precision with which he navigated both the criminal and political underworlds. Fidel, in turn, sees Carlos not just as a younger brother, but as someone who can turn this rough-edged movement into a lasting institution. They argue, often. Fidel wants power, fast. He's fine with drug revenue, with brute tactics, with bending morality if it gets results. Carlos is more meticulous, sometimes annoyingly so. He talks about public trust, about building a national conscience, even as his boots are caked in the same blood as Fidel's. The arguments end in silence, never resolution. Vicente, the middle brother, is the bridge. He doesn't talk much, but he remembers everything. He runs the logistics, safe houses, transport, communication channels. When Carlos dreams, it's Vicente who makes those dreams printable in ink and executable on paper. The brothers build their fortress together, not just of sandbags and trenches, but of influence. They insert men into local councils. They broker meetings between businessmen and regional mayors. They give money to schools, then quietly tell teachers what can and can't be taught. One hand offers bread, the other holds the ledger. Many people still think that Carlos and Fidel drifted apart later due to ideological differences. So what do you think? Were they ever truly aligned? Or just two wolves running parallel until the food ran low? Whispers begin to spread of cracks in the Castaño triad. Fidel is becoming harder to reach, operating from deeper in the shadows. Some say he's making side deals with narcos that Carlos refuses to touch. Others suggest he's simply burned out. The stress of constant warfare, political pressure, and managing killers is enough to corrode any bond. Then comes the day no one forgets. Fidel disappears. No warning, no announcement. Just gone. Some say he fled the country. Others believe he was assassinated. Maybe by guerrillas, maybe by rivals, maybe even by Carlos himself. The vacuum left behind is immense, not just strategically but emotionally. Carlos doesn't speak publicly about Fidel's disappearance. Not once. But those closest to him notice subtle changes. His voice loses some of its warmth. His laughter, already rare, vanishes. He begins isolating himself from commanders, preferring late nights alone with maps, radios, and half-burned letters. In a rare moment of candor, Vicente reportedly tells a confidant, Carlos mourns with his silence. He builds walls out of silence, and that silence becomes policy. From now on, loyalty isn't just valued, it's audited. One whispered complaint, one careless gesture, and you're replaced. Or worse, Carlos becomes both more focused and more ruthless. He expands the movement's reach into new regions. Córdoba, Bolívar, Magdalena. The network tightens, deadlines shorten, enemies multiply, and yet, something in him frays. Without Fidel to challenge him, Carlos becomes the sole conscience of the movement. The man who once advocated for surgical strikes now approves broad campaigns. Entire communities are judged by their leanings. The line between collaboration and survival vanishes, but even as paranoia rises, the brothers' legacy endures. The Castaños didn't just build a paramilitary group, they institutionalized one. The United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, is no longer a rogue militia. It's a brand, and Carlos is now its reluctant but undisputed CEO. From a cluster of improvised militias and whispered alliances, Carlos Castaño engineers something larger, something terrifying in its efficiency. The AUC, Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, isn't just a military machine, it's a hydra, a nationwide confederation of paramilitary blocks, each with its own commanders, territories, enemies, and revenue streams, yet all under the loose ideological umbrella of self-defense. It's 1997 when the AUC is formally declared, but by the early 2000s, it's already operating like a shadow state. In many rural regions, the Colombian government is just a rumor. Roads go unrepaired, police stations abandoned, mayors bribed or terrified into compliance. But when the AUC arrives, things function. Goods move. Guerrillas retreat. Crime drops. At least the kind not sanctioned by the paramilitaries. Carlos isn't the field general anymore. He rarely carries a rifle now. His weapon is his voice, and the strange mix of charisma, caution, and coldness that surrounds it. He issues communiques, grants interviews sparingly, and delivers occasional directives to commanders. His signature? Always calm, always righteous, always dangerous. Information closest to Carlos shows that he begins modeling his leadership after statecraft. He assigns territory like a bureaucrat would assign departments. He manages egos, quells mutinies, and juggles diplomacy between blocs. In private meetings, he speaks of Colombia's future, of national unity, of a day when the AUC won't need to exist. He sometimes seems to believe it, and yet, what fuels this machine is not just ideology, it's cocaine. Many of the regional AUC commanders, especially in the north and along the Caribbean coast, are knee-deep in the drug trade. Some have entire processing labs. Others control export routes. And while Carlos claims to oppose narco-trafficking, he's pragmatic. The war needs funds. And cocaine, like it or not, writes the checks. He tries to set boundaries, tax the traffickers, don't become them. But the line blurs quickly. Trucks move in daylight. Planes disappear into jungle airstrips. Soldiers take home cash bonuses. Entire communities become dependent on this illicit ecosystem. Carlos knows it, tries to contain it, but the current pulls hard. Many people still think that Carlos's anti-drug stance was a facade. So what do you think? Was he reluctantly enabling an economic necessity? Or was he preaching sobriety while sipping from the same poisoned chalice? Either way, the AUC grows fast. Too fast. By 2001, they claim over 11,000 fighters, spread across more than 30 different blocks. Some are professional, others barely trained. Some loyal, others opportunistic. It's an army stitched together with ideology, money, and fear. And Carlos sits at the head of it. Respected, resented, revered. He rarely visits the front lines now. Instead, he travels with a tight security ring, hopping between ranches and safe houses. His meetings are often short, his questions piercing. How many guerrillas? How much income this month? Have the leaflets gone out? He demands not just violence, but narrative. For every massacre, a justification. For every displacement, a press release. The AUC becomes a kind of propaganda machine. They publish newsletters, release videos, even operate radio stations in some areas. The message is always the same. We are Colombia's last line of defense, but not everyone buys it. Human rights groups begin compiling reports. Stories leak of scorched villages, of children pressed into service, of informants left in ditches. Carlos denies the worst of it, distances himself when needed, removes commanders who get too sloppy or too loud. But the blood doesn't wash off easily. There's one particular report, a leaked UN document, that rattles him. It names the AUC as a principal contributor to Colombia's internal displacement crisis. Over 3 million people forced from their homes. That night, Carlos cancels all meetings. He sits alone with a shortwave radio, scanning frequencies like a man listening for his conscience. Even so, the machine doesn't slow. If anything, it accelerates. The AUC begins targeting guerrilla strongholds with increased ferocity. They take towns, push deeper into coca-producing regions, and choke supply routes. And for a time, it works. Guerrilla activity in some regions drops by over 60%, but every expansion brings new problems. More corruption, more rogue commanders, more press scrutiny. Carlos tries to hold the center, but it's starting to splinter. He's no longer the man building an idea. He's the man trying to stop it from collapsing under its own weight. Carlos stands at the edge of a moral cliff, and still, he keeps walking. Each step further entwines him in the very thing he once claimed to oppose. The drug trade, long kept at a calculated arm's length, is now at his door, sitting at his table, and sometimes laughing in his ear. It begins with war taxes. Cocaine producers pay to operate in paramilitary controlled zones. At first, it's framed as a toll, compensation for security, for stability, for keeping guerrillas at bay. But quickly, the AUC isn't just taxing the drug trade. They're part of it, and Carlos knows it. Information closest to him suggests he still clings to the idea that his bloc, the Castaño-led Autodefensas Campesinas de Córdoba y Urabá, ACCU, maintains a moral superiority, that they're different from the traffickers who poison cities and bribe politicians. But even as he says this aloud, his commanders are overseeing cocaine routes, coordinating with smugglers, and laundering money through front companies in Medellin and Bogotá. It's not idealism anymore. It's infrastructure. One of his closest advisors reportedly tells him, "You can't build a clean house on dirty ground." Carlos responds only with a long stare. No denial, no agreement. Just the heavy silence of a man learning that principles don't fund revolutions. Many people still think that Carlos was simply outmatched by the momentum of his own machine. So what do you think? Was he dragged into complicity, or did he walk in eyes wide open? There's a turning point that historians love to cite. A secret meeting in a countryside hacienda between Carlos's lieutenants and mid-level traffickers. Officially, Carlos didn't attend, but those who were there say he was watching through a crack in the wall, listening without speaking, a ghost at the summit of his own contradictions. From that point forward, the AUC becomes both an army and a business empire. Cocaine funds weapons, vehicles, salaries. Cartel money smooths over political alliances. In return, the paramilitaries protect labs, silence informants, and eliminate competitors. Some blocs evolve into full-blown narco armies. Others stay ideologically cloaked, but the stench of profit clings to them all. Carlos tries to draw lines, even late into the night. He issues internal memorandums, attempts to audit finances, even purges a few commanders suspected of skimming or going rogue. But he's no longer in full control. He's the architect of a skyscraper that keeps adding floors without his permission. He still speaks of values, still publishes communiqué decrying guerrilla kidnappings, promising to respect civilians, condemning drug abuse. His words echo with conviction. But in the jungle, it's the bullets that speak louder. There's a famous incident in Meta, a coca-producing region once dominated by the FARC, now under AUC control. Carlos tours the area briefly, meets with locals, offers the same practiced message of peace through strength. But days later, his men massacre several farm workers suspected of aiding guerrillas. The news breaks internationally. Carlos blames rogue elements. Internally, he's furious. But he does nothing to discipline the commander responsible. Why? Because that commander delivers results, and results keep the donors happy, the mayors quiet, and the lieutenants loyal. By now, Carlos is surrounded by two types of men, those who still believe and those who know better. He plays both sides expertly, knowing that the illusion of order is sometimes all you need to maintain it. He still talks about democracy, still claims that the AUC will disarm once the guerrilla threat is gone. But as timelines stretch and as conditions multiply, even the Colombian government begins to take notice. International pressure mounts. The United States designates the AUC as a terrorist organization in 2001. Suddenly, Carlos isn't just a controversial local figure. He's on global watch lists. His bank accounts freeze. His name is whispered in embassies. It bothers him deeply. He begins retreating from public life. Fewer interviews, less contact with the press. He grows more selective with visitors. Some say he becomes paranoid. Others say he becomes honest, finally realizing what he's built. At night, in one of his rural hideouts, He listens to radio broadcasts from Bogotá. A priest delivers a sermon about moral compromise. Carlos writes something in his leather notebook. When the soul splits, the body follows. No one knows if he's writing about himself, his brother, or the country, but the AUC doesn't pause. The funding flows, the violence escalates, and Carlos, once a boy searching for justice, is now a man negotiating with devils to keep his creation from devouring itself. He used to be a ghost in the jungle. Now Carlos Castaño is a paradox in the headlines. To some, he's the last wall standing between Colombia and a complete Marxist insurgency. To others, he's just another warlord with better diction and a cleaner shirt. The truth, as always, hangs somewhere in the fog. But perception is everything, and Carlos knows it. He begins investing more time in shaping his public image, an effort not of vanity, but of strategy. The war isn't just being fought with rifles anymore. It's also playing out in newspapers, on television, and in hushed congressional corridors. Carlos wants to be seen. But more than that, he wants to be understood. He agrees to an interview with Semana, Colombia's largest news magazine. He insists it be written, not filmed. He wears a clean button-down shirt, sits beneath a crucifix, and refers to himself not as a commander, but as a defender of the nation's soul. It's carefully crafted theater, but the message is sharp. In the interview, he condemns the guerrillas, calls for a national reconciliation process, and even speaks of disarmament eventually. He frames the AUC not as a paramilitary force, but as a necessary civic structure. His words spark outrage and curiosity in equal measure. Information closest to Carlos suggests this isn't just propaganda. He believes it, at least part of it. He believes that if the public sees him as a moral actor, even a flawed one, they'll hesitate to call him a monster. And hesitation, in wartime, is a kind of power. Many people still think that Carlos's media appearances were just a smokescreen. So what do you think? Can a man who orders massacres and signs peace manifestos be both sincere and manipulative in the same breath? Still, the image control effort doesn't stop with interviews. The AUC begins distributing community newsletters, printed in-house, delivered by hand to villages under their control. The language is pastoral, even poetic. Updates on security efforts, reminders about curfews, quotes from scripture. You could mistake them for church bulletins, if not for the subtle threats between the lines. Carlos also orders the creation of a kind of internal ethics code for AUC fighters. No drug use, no sexual abuse, no theft, respect for civilians. In theory, these rules are posted at checkpoints and repeated during training sessions. In practice, violations are frequent, and enforcement varies by commander. But the gesture allows Carlos to say, "We are not savages. We have rules." One of the most surreal moments in this image war comes when Carlos arranges for a town's festival to proceed under AUC protection. A traveling circus sets up in the square. Children eat cotton candy under the watchful eyes of armed guards. At one point, a clown juggles flaming pins while a pickup truck full of paramilitaries passes behind him. The contrast is absurd, and yet locals, many of them grateful for the relative calm, cheer anyway. This is Carlos's tightrope, offering order while hiding the chaos that funds it, speaking peace while stockpiling ammunition. There's a particular day that captures this contradiction. A Catholic bishop publicly denounces the AUC's presence in his diocese. That same night, the church's generator is destroyed. No one is hurt, but the message is clear. The next Sunday, the bishop leaves town. Carlos tells the press he regrets the incident. He also claims to have no knowledge of who was responsible. Privately, he scribbles something in his journal. Faith must not interfere with duty. Even those within his own ranks begin to wonder where the line is, if it exists at all. Some commanders admire him as a visionary. Others whisper that he's gone soft, that while they're out risking their lives, Carlos is giving interviews and quoting poetry. But Carlos isn't trying to impress his men anymore. He's trying to impress history. He studies transitional justice frameworks, models from South Africa and Northern Ireland. He speaks of demobilization, of truth commissions, of land reform. Sometimes, he even believes the war might end, that the country might forgive, that he might live to walk the streets without a security escort. But deep down, he also knows what he's done, what he's ordered, what he's enabled, so he keeps speaking softly, wearing clean shirts, sitting straight in interviews. Because image isn't just survival, it's the only path back. Something shifts in the air, slow at first, then unmistakable. The AUC, once built on the illusion of defense, begins to morph into something more aggressive, more predatory. What started as a reaction to guerrilla violence is now a sprawling machine with its own hunger. Carlos feels it happening, even as he tries to steer the ship. The problem isn't the war, it's the mission creep. Too many commanders with too many enemies, too many personal feuds disguised as patriotic operations. The narrative of righteous retaliation begins to buckle under the weight of what's really going on. Power consolidations, economic interests, score settling. By the early 2000s, the AUC is no longer content with holding ground. It's expanding, offensively. Paramilitary incursions are now reaching deep into guerrilla zones. Entire towns become battlegrounds. Civilians are caught in the middle. And suddenly, the violence that was once targeted begins to blur. Who's a guerrilla sympathizer? Who's just trying to survive? Carlos authorizes larger operations, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes not. One in particular, the El Salado massacre, rattles the country. Over several days, paramilitary troops kill dozens of civilians in the village, accusing them of collaborating with the FARC. Some reports claim as many as 100 dead, though the numbers remain disputed. Carlos doesn't deny the event, but he frames it as an unfortunate necessity in a war where enemies often wear civilian clothes. Information closest to Carlos from that time suggests he viewed such massacres as tactical failures, not moral ones. What upset him wasn't the blood, it was the backlash. Many people still think that Carlos deliberately escalated the violence to send a message. So what do you think? Was he losing control of his commanders, or was he redefining the rules of engagement? Back in Bogotá and abroad, human rights groups explode with condemnation. The international spotlight burns hotter. The United Nations issues reports. U.S. diplomats begin re-evaluating how closely Colombia's military and political class are entwined with paramilitary structures. It's not just guerrillas who are being targeted. It's journalists, labor organizers, indigenous leaders. Carlos responds with another manifesto, this one more defensive, more polished. He speaks of unregulated sectors, of local errors, and urges greater discipline among units. But behind closed doors, he is livid, not at the massacres themselves, but at how sloppily they were handled. To Carlos, optics are everything, not because he craves applause, but because bad optics bring unwanted interference. He begins holding more private meetings with top commanders. They're tense. Some respect him as the original voice of the movement. Others, especially the younger, more brutal bloc leaders, see him as an obstacle. He talks philosophy. They talk cocaine roots. It's during this time that cracks widen. The AUC isn't a monolith anymore. It's a confederation of ambition, greed, and fatigue. And Carlos, once the magnetic center, is starting to feel gravity shift away from him. In regions like Norte de Santander and Putumayo, paramilitary units start conducting operations without even notifying central leadership. Entire offensives occur in Carlos's name that he never approved. He tries to reassert control through internal memos, phone calls, chain of command protocols. But it's like trying to leash a river. One commander is caught executing teenagers suspected of guerrilla ties. Another is found laundering millions through a real estate portfolio in Panama. Carlos demotes a few, exiles one. But for every problem he cuts off, 2 new ones emerge. Still, he holds onto the image. He dresses the same. He speaks with the same calm cadence. He signs his letters with the same looping flourish. But he knows. He absolutely knows. The AUC is no longer what he intended, if it ever truly was. One night, during a late meeting in a candlelit farmhouse, he reportedly tells a close aide, "This was never meant to become a mirror of what we fought." And the aide, unsure whether to comfort or agree, simply nods. Carlos begins withdrawing from field operations altogether. He isolates himself further. Fewer public appearances, more encrypted messages, fewer trusted lieutenants. But even in retreat, he's watching. He receives reports daily. Casualty numbers, territory gains, rumors of rogue units. His notebook grows thicker, his eyes darker. He knows what's coming. The violence has reached a point where it no longer serves a purpose. It just feeds itself. And like a fire that began as a controlled burn, the AUC's expansion is now threatening to engulf its architect. The escalation isn't a question anymore. It's a condition. And Carlos, whether he admits it or not, is being dragged along by the beast he once led. The smoke hasn't cleared, but the government is beginning to cough. After years of sidelong glances and convenient silences, the Colombian state can no longer ignore what the AUC has become. International pressure mounts. Human rights reports pile higher on congressional desks. Washington starts asking harder questions. The world's patience with Carlos Castaño and the illusion of controlled paramilitarism is running thin. Carlos sees it coming. Long before Bogotá sends official feelers, he begins speaking of negotiations, not surrender, not defeat, but dialogue. A political solution, he calls it. A mutual demobilization process, structured, gradual, with dignity. He insists on certain preconditions: security guarantees for fighters, representation for victims of guerrilla violence, legal frameworks that don't treat his men like terrorists. He doesn't frame it as weakness. To Carlos, it's evolution. The logical next step in the narrative he's been crafting since the beginning. He's done the dirty work of reclaiming the country from insurgents. Now, it's time to hand it back. On his terms. Information closest to Carlos suggests that he becomes increasingly invested in these overtures. He writes draft proposals, studies peace agreements from other nations, Northern Ireland, South Africa, El Salvador. He highlights passages in blue ink and underlines key phrases: reconciliation, amnesty, reintegration. But as he talks peace, his commanders prepare for war. Many within the AUC leadership don't want negotiations. They've built empires, drug routes, political leverage, local monopolies. Demobilization threatens that. What Carlos calls evolution, they call betrayal. Many people still think that Carlos's peace proposals were stalling tactics to avoid extradition. So what do you think? Was he truly seeking resolution, or simply trying to step off the battlefield with clean shoes? The Colombian government responds cautiously. President Alvaro Uribe, himself once accused of paramilitary sympathies, publicly denounces illegal armed groups while privately entertaining back-channel discussions. It's politics at its murkiest. At the same time, guerrilla violence continues. Cities tremble under bomb threats. Mayors wear bulletproof vests to council meetings. In this climate, Carlos releases one of his most famous public statements. In it, he declares the AUC's willingness to explore peace with honor. He outlines the conditions, territorial guarantees, legal protections, and a truth commission that includes testimony from both sides of the conflict. It reads like a manifesto and a challenge. The response is mixed. Some applaud the move. Others accuse him of whitewashing years of atrocities. Victims' groups protest. The military fumes. But behind the noise, quiet meetings begin. Low-level envoys, priests acting as intermediaries, UN observers asking questions in whispers. Carlos doesn't attend these sessions himself. He sends representatives, lawyers, spokesmen, a former journalist turned negotiator. He stays in the background, pulling strings, shaping narratives. He writes speeches he never gives, rehearses answers to questions no one is brave enough to ask. Privately, he begins preparing for a life after war. He speaks to friends about starting a foundation for conflict resolution, a think tank, maybe. He dreams of publishing a book, not a memoir, more of a reflection, something that explains the path, not just justifies it. But the noise outside grows louder. The AUC's infighting deepens. One bloc accuses another of cooperating with guerrillas for coca fields. Another refuses to halt operations even as talks progress. Assassinations spike. Commanders go missing. Territories shift overnight. Peace, once imagined as a straight line, is now a maze of traps. Carlos is squeezed. On one side, the state wants a clean end to a dirty war. On the other, his own commanders want no end at all. They like the war. They profit from it. They fear peace more than prison. There's a notable moment, captured only in rumor, where Carlos meets secretly with two rival bloc leaders at a countryside hacienda. The conversation turns heated. Carlos insists on the necessity of talks. One commander pounds the table. "You want peace because you're tired," he says. "We're not." The meeting ends with no resolution. Days later, that commander is killed. Officially, it's blamed on guerrillas. Unofficially, everyone knows better. Carlos says nothing, writes nothing. But those who know him say he begins sleeping less. Back in the capital, the government announces its intention to hold formal peace dialogues with paramilitary leaders. Carlos is included. But by now, his position within the AUC has become symbolic. He speaks, but fewer listen. He proposes, but fewer follow. Still, he persists. Because whether by conviction or compulsion, Carlos wants the curtain to fall with a speech, not a gunshot. Carlos Castaño has always known the price of leadership. But now, he begins to learn the cost of command without control. The AUC, once a federation bound by urgency and ideology, is unraveling under its own weight. And Carlos, who once orchestrated it like a quiet conductor, finds himself increasingly isolated. Respected, yes, but no longer obeyed. Reports of atrocities multiply. In Caquetá, a school is burned with families inside. In Sucre, witnesses describe a mass grave beneath a soccer field. These aren't surgical strikes or regrettable excesses. They're spectacles of dominance, meant to terrorize, not liberate. Carlos reads the reports. Some make him wince, some make him furious. But more and more, his reaction is silence. Information closest to Carlos indicates that he begins keeping 2 journals now. One public, full of notes about policy, negotiation drafts, strategy memos. The other, private, is messier, scribbled thoughts, despairing lines, fragments of poetry. In one entry, he writes, "How do you end a war when your army likes the battlefield more than the flag? As the violence spirals, so does the paranoia." Carlos starts suspecting those closest to him, not of betrayal, necessarily, but of choosing pragmatism over principle. His circle shrinks. Meetings are shorter, more guarded. Messages are encrypted, hand-delivered. Even his brother Vicente becomes harder to reach. Some say by choice, others say out of fear. Carlos's concern isn't just with betrayal from within. The state is shifting too. President Uribe has begun talking openly about extraditing paramilitary leaders to the U.S. for drug trafficking. The tone of the government's negotiation changes. It's colder now, less deferential, more impatient. Many people still think that Carlos's push for peace was a strategic play to avoid extradition. So what do you think? Was it self-preservation disguised as statesmanship? Or did he still believe in the redemption of a fractured country? Either way, the walls are closing in. Carlos tries one last public maneuver. He issues a direct address to President Uribe. In it, he proposes a roadmap for peace, one with strict timelines, transparent verification, and international supervision. He speaks of forgiveness, of victims' rights, of land restitution. The language is polished, earnest, almost desperate. It is met with polite applause and private dismissal. At the same time, foreign observers begin suggesting that Carlos may no longer be safe, not from the state, but from his own. The AUC, now bloated with power and criminal revenue, sees peace as a threat to business. And Carlos, who once shaped the narrative, is now seen as a liability. One night, a trusted aide warns him, "You're not negotiating for the AUC anymore. You're negotiating against it." Carlos nods. He's known this for a while, but hearing it aloud makes it real. In response, he attempts to strengthen alliances with moderate bloc leaders. He arranges a private summit in a remote ranch house outside Monteria. Only a handful attend. The rest send excuses. One sends a threat. Carlos delivers a long speech that night. No cameras, no recorders, just men and their weapons, sitting beneath bare bulbs. He speaks not of glory, but of consequences, of history's verdict, of what it means to win a war and still lose a country. Some listen, most look away. Afterwards, a young commander approaches him. "You talk like you're already gone," he says. Carlos forces a smile. "I've been leaving for years." The next week, an intercepted communique suggests a vote is being taken among the most powerful blocs to formally remove Carlos as spokesperson. Not with fanfare, not with a declaration, just with silence. He'd keep the title. But the calls would stop coming. The updates would dry up. He doesn't protest. He simply writes another note in his journal. Even kings who build their castles from memory still drown when the tide forgets them. And so, Carlos drifts further into exile. Not of geography, but of relevance. He remains a symbol, yes, a name whispered in reverence or disgust. But his shadow no longer stretches across Colombia like it once did. He still receives reports, still meets with those who will see him. But more and more, he feels like a man watching his reflection sink behind the waves. And somewhere in that quiet, a question begins to take root. A question Carlos never thought he'd ask. What if the story ends without a legacy at all? There's an old saying whispered among men who've seen too much war. The silence after a betrayal is louder than the bullet. Carlos Castaño is learning that now, in real time. Not with gunfire, but with absence. The phones that once rang constantly are quiet. The envoys have stopped arriving. Even the press, once eager for his declarations, has turned its gaze elsewhere. It's not that he's been forgotten, it's that he's being erased. Factions within the AUC are no longer waiting for Carlos's blessing. They're striking deals directly with drug lords, mayors, businessmen. Autonomy is the new currency. Loyalty is antique. And for many, Carlos is just that, antique. A relic from the era when this all still meant something besides profit margins and territory control. Information closest to Carlos in these final months of prominence paints a strange portrait. A man pacing the same room, the same safe house, day after day. Maps pinned on walls with no pushpins left to add. A shelf of Catholic texts beside a growing stack of demobilization drafts. He's restless, but going nowhere. Committed, but sidelined. And then, the most intimate loss of all, family. In March 2004, his brother Vicente is captured by Colombian authorities after years of covert operations and internal friction. For Carlos, it's a break in the last thread, tethering him to what the AUC once was. The Castaño brothers had been the spine, if not the soul, of the movement. Now, with Fidel long presumed dead and Vicente in custody, Carlos is alone, not symbolically, but absolutely. He doesn't show it outwardly. He still issues statements, still signs documents, still scribbles in that leather notebook. But those closest to him notice a dimming. The cadence in his speech slows. His meals go untouched. His prayers grow longer. Many people still think that Vicente's capture was orchestrated from within. So what do you think? Was it the state cleaning house, or the paramilitary leadership taking out its own liabilities? There's a photograph, taken secretly and never officially published, of Carlos at a remote finca, seated beneath a guava tree. He's barefoot, surrounded by bodyguards, but staring off into the distance with a look that says more than any interview ever could. It's not sadness. It's not fear. It's vacancy. He begins making arrangements, not just for negotiations, but for legacy. He contacts human rights lawyers, asks about truth commissions, offers to testify in exchange for protection. He's no longer bargaining like a man holding a hand of cards. He's trying to cash out before the table flips over. The government, sensing his vulnerability, begins to press harder. They demand a full list of crimes, a full account of his personal finances, guarantees of non-participation in drug trade. Carlos drags his feet, not to protect himself, but to buy time, because time is running out. In April 2004, something happens that jolts even the most cynical observers. Carlos disappears, not in the theatrical, fugitive sense. No manhunt, no helicopters, no flaming headlines. Just gone. One day, he's exchanging calls with a government emissary. The next, nothing. No radio contact, no sightings, no messages from his usual couriers. His guards claim he left on foot for a short trip and never returned. Some say he was abducted. Others say he fled. A few whisper that he was executed by his own men for knowing too much. His body is never officially recovered, but the silence that follows is louder than any funeral. A man who spent decades crafting his image, issuing statements, leading an army of shadows, vanishes without a trace. The Colombian government neither confirms nor denies knowledge of his fate. A few weeks later, a statement from the AUC's leadership simply reads, "We thank Comandante Carlos for his service. We now move forward in unity." That unity doesn't last long. In the months that follow, the AUC fragments further. Some blocs enter peace talks. Others return fully to narco-trafficking. The myth of a unified force dies with Carlos's absence. Or perhaps it was already dead, and he had simply refused to read the obituary. Some still believe he's alive, living under a new name in the Venezuelan countryside, or deep in the jungle under FARC protection. Others believe he was quietly killed and buried in a shallow grave on land he once swore to defend. But one thing is certain. Carlos Castaño Gil, the boy from Antioquia who tried to shape a nation through violence, disappeared as mysteriously as he emerged. A final note is later found in one of his journals. It reads, "Peace never came, only silence." And in the end, perhaps they are the same thing. After Carlos's disappearance in April 2004, the jungle doesn't whisper his name. It forgets it. No tomb, no farewell speech, no fading photograph taped to a candlelit wall. Just absence. And in Colombia, where ghosts often outlive the living, his vanishing act leaves a vacuum. Strategically, emotionally, and symbolically, the remaining AUC leadership scrambles to adapt. Without Carlos, the figurehead of political sophistication is gone. What remains are regional commanders, each with their own turf, their own agendas, and very little interest in national vision. For them, Carlos had become inconvenient long before he disappeared. His calls for demobilization, accountability, reconciliation, these were interruptions. Now, they are erased. One by one, AUC blocs begin drifting off the agreed peace path. Some continue participating in government talks, eager for legal immunity. Others reject the process outright, choosing to entrench deeper into coca territories and urban strongholds. The umbrella Carlos had once stitched together with doctrine, fear, and charisma is folding fast, and the state? It plays both mourner and opportunist. On paper, Carlos is declared missing, presumed dead. Behind closed doors, officials breathe easier. His testimony, had he lived, would have named names, powerful ones, politicians, generals, financiers, men who shared tables with him even as they denied knowing him. That risk has now vanished. Information closest to Carlos's final days, those gathered from former aides and intelligence briefings, points to one consistent possibility: internal betrayal. A targeted removal by his own men, not out of malice, but necessity. He had become a liability, and in the world he built, liabilities don't retire. Many people still think that Carlos faked his own death and lives in exile under a new identity. So what do you think? Did he choose vanishing over martyrdom? Or did someone else make that choice for him? What's undeniable is the ripple effect. His absence reshapes the AUC's political posture. The demobilization process continues, on paper, but without its moral architect, it becomes more of a transaction than a transformation. Fighters surrender weapons, receive stipends, and disappear into crowded neighborhoods with new names and old habits. Some join criminal successor groups. Others vanish like their leader, just quieter. Communities that once feared the AUC's boots now fear the vacuum. In towns where Carlos's directives once promised protection, new banners rise, some red, some black, some with no name at all. The violence returns in smaller, sharper bursts. It no longer wears ideology. It just wants rent. Meanwhile, victims' families, thousands of them, gather in town halls, courtrooms, and roadside vigils, clutching photographs of loved ones who never returned. They ask for truth, for justice, for names. But the one man who knew the whole story is gone, and those left behind offer only fragments, denials, or nervous silence. A few NGOs publish detailed timelines of Carlos's career, trying to understand how a cattle rancher's son became one of the most feared and enigmatic figures in Latin America. His image, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, unsmiling, graces covers of human rights reports and war crime dossiers. There's no consensus. To some, he was a patriot who lost control of a necessary machine. To others, he was a mass murderer who cloaked terror in speeches and crucifixes. But most agree on this. Carlos Castaño Gil was never simple. Even those who hated him admit that without him, the AUC would never have grown into what it became. And without him, it couldn't hold together. He was the spine. And when the spine snapped, the body collapsed inward. Years later, a retired soldier tells a reporter, "Carlos, he didn't die. He just stopped being useful." There's a strange kind of peace in that statement. A finality without ritual, a disappearance without mythology. In the hills of Antioquia, where he was born, some old farmers still remember him as a boy. They say he once cried over a calf that had broken its leg, that he buried it himself under a tree with his hands. Others remember the sound of helicopters and rifles that followed years later and say nothing. One of those farmers carves a single word into the trunk of that tree. Desaparecido. Disappeared. It's not a monument. It's a warning. The storm is over, but nothing feels settled. Carlos Castaño Gil has vanished. Not into legend, not into martyrdom, just into the blank. No bulletproof biography, no confirmed burial. Just a missing person report lost in a war with too many names scratched out and too many silences that stretch longer than memory. And yet, his absence doesn't erase his fingerprints. Throughout Colombia, the terrain still bears the scar tissue of his reign. Former AUC territories, many of them now under the nominal control of the state, operate in uneasy silence. Police patrol in daylight, but disappear at dusk. Children don't ask questions. Farmers plow carefully around unmarked graves. In places like Córdoba, Bolívar, and Norte de Santander, successor groups begin to emerge. They go by different names: Águilas Negras, Los Rastrojos, Autodefensas Gaitanistas, but the DNA is familiar. Many are led by former mid-tier AUC commanders who demobilized, collected government subsidies, then quietly rearmed. They no longer pretend to fight for Colombia's soul. Now they fight for turf, for drugs, for gold, for silence. Many people still think that Carlos's vision was too idealistic to survive the greed of his successors. So what do you think? Was he the last believer in a cause, or just the first to dress a racket in righteous words? The peace process, meanwhile, limps forward. Between 2003 and 2006, over 30,000 paramilitary fighters officially demobilize. They hand over weapons, participate in truth hearings, receive reintegration benefits. But the numbers are deceptive. Some quietly rejoin armed life. Some become assassins for hire. Others, haunted by what they've done, vanish in a different way, swallowed by guilt, shame, or drink. Victims groups demand more truth, more trials, more names. Some receive justice, many don't. For every televised confession, there are 10 whispered threats. For every exhumed grave, 100 remain hidden beneath banana groves or cattle pastures. And the truth commissions? They try their best. Testimonies pile high, maps are drawn, legal definitions debated. But the system is overwhelmed. Too many ghosts, not enough names, not enough living witnesses, not enough political will. Information closest to the ongoing fallout shows that Carlos's name becomes a kind of linguistic landmine, mentioned cautiously in courtrooms, avoided in campaign speeches, spoken with reverence by some and revulsion by others. A symbol too sharp to hold without cutting yourself. In 2006, a human rights exhibition in Bogotá includes a wall of Colombia's most influential conflict figures. Among them, a black and white photo of Carlos. No plaque, just his name and the dates, 1965. A college student stares at the photo for a long time, then asks, "So, was he the bad guy or the good guy?" The guide sighs and says, "Both and neither." And that's where the story rests now, in the hollow between what happened and what's remembered, between the facts on paper and the quiet that lingers in the hills. Because the truth is, Carlos didn't leave a legacy. He left a riddle scrawled in burned villages, empty courtrooms, unmarked graves, and memoirs left unwritten. He is both the architect and the ghost, a man who tried to outmaneuver chaos by building a stricter kind, a man who promised order but delivered silence. And maybe that's what remains in the end. Not a judgment, not even understanding. Just the hush after someone powerful walks out of a room and doesn't come back. So, as we reach the final edge of this tale, let's let the pace slow. The jungle exhales, the rifles rust, the propaganda posters curl and flake under the sun. In a field somewhere in Antioquia, a tree still stands. No camera knows which one, no coordinates, just roots wrapped around the same red clay that raised a boy named Carlos before he picked up a rifle, before he wrote his first command, before he disappeared. Maybe he's still there, in the quiet between memory and myth. Or maybe he was always meant to vanish, like so many in this war. So tonight, as you rest your head and the fan hums softly in the background, let that be enough. The story ends, not with a bang, not with a funeral, but with a whisper. And sometimes that's all history gives us. The man may have vanished, but the footprint he left behind continues to twist through Colombia's soil like a root that refuses to rot. Carlos Castaño's death, or disappearance, marks the beginning of a fractured legacy. Without him, the AUC's ideological center evaporates, leaving behind a power structure that's more pyramid scheme than military doctrine. In the vacuum, former paramilitary commanders rebrand themselves as businessmen, local political bosses, or, more often than not, leaders of newly emerging criminal empires. Some of them wear suits now, others never stopped wearing fatigues. And the people? They learn new names for the same fear. Los Urabeños, Clan del Golfo, the Black Eagles. Different acronyms, same rules. Pay the tax, don't ask questions, keep your head down. The flags may change, but the checkpoints still appear on the same roads, often guarded by the same faces. Carlos had once promised the AUC would never become a cartel. He had insisted it was a movement of self-defense, not greed. That moral clarity, flawed as it was, dissolves now under a flood of cocaine, gold smuggling, and weapons trafficking. By 2007, Colombia's criminal landscape is more fragmented, more brutal, and less ideological than it has ever been. Many people still think that, without Carlos's moderating influence, the paramilitary project decayed into pure criminality. So what do you think? Did his absence accelerate the rot? Or just remove the veil that had covered it all along? Information closest to the political aftermath shows how the state attempts to regain control. The Justice and Peace Law, originally designed to demobilize paramilitaries through leniency and truth-telling, becomes a legal swamp. Trials stall. Testimonies contradict. Judges fear retaliation. Many demobilized fighters fail to reintegrate. Some vanish into Colombia's urban underworld. Others take up arms again in quieter, less visible ways. In some regions, commanders who once fought under Carlos begin running for office. Local elections become chessboards of influence. Campaigns are quietly funded by former AUC financiers. Voters, caught between memories of guerrilla terror and paramilitary order, often choose the devil they know. A leaked internal document from Colombia's security services reveals something chilling. Over 100 current elected officials are suspected of ties to paramilitary groups. Some of them deny it. Others dismiss it as ancient history. But the numbers tell another story. Carlos's shadow is still sitting in government chairs. Even internationally, the echoes linger. Human rights advocates continue to file complaints with the International Criminal Court. Some hope that one day, with new evidence, cases against former AUC leaders will reopen. They still want the full story. They want truth commissions to mention Carlos's name without flinching. But the truth, like the man, is elusive. In rural communities once dominated by AUC rule, opinions remain split. An old man in Urabá tells a reporter, "When the guerrillas left, Carlos's men brought peace. Violent peace, but peace." A young mother in Sucre disagrees. She lost her father to a paramilitary raid and never received an explanation. "They said he was a collaborator," she says, "but they never said what that meant." The truth is, no one really knows what collaboration meant, or resistance, or justice. These definitions blurred long ago, redrawn by rifles and radio broadcasts. And with Carlos gone, no one is left to explain. There are rumors still. Every few years, someone claims to have seen him at a small cafe in Ecuador, behind tinted windows in Honduras, walking with a limp through a Venezuelan border town. These stories rarely last. But they don't die either, because Colombia has a strange relationship with its ghosts. It doesn't bury them so much as let them wander, appearing in headlines, in backroom conversations, in the collective nervous system of a country still trying to map its trauma. Carlos's legacy is not a statue in a square. It's not a date on a textbook timeline. It's an unease, a lingering sense that beneath the roads paved by peace talks and demobilization, something old and unquiet still breathes. And in some ways, that may be the most fitting tribute for the man who once said, "This war didn't start with me, and it won't end with me either." He was right. History, when it finally tries to speak clearly about Carlos Castaño Gil, often does so through the mouths of those who lived through the dust. To understand his legacy, you have to walk the streets where he ruled, talk to the people who still speak his name with either a grim nod or a clenched jaw. Because while books may list him as a paramilitary leader or missing person, in many villages, he's remembered as something more spectral, like a caution, a storm that passed but left the humidity behind. In a small town near Monteria, an old shopkeeper keeps a rusted walkie-talkie behind the counter. He says it doesn't work anymore, but won't throw it away. It was from when we used to report to the patrols, he mutters. No emotion. No nostalgia. Just fact. He doesn't say Carlos's name. He just gestures upward, vaguely, as if that era still hangs in the trees. But memory is not universal. In the capital, a new generation grows up with little more than a footnote of his existence. College students debate the legacy of the AUC like it's a term paper topic. Some sympathize with the narrative of self-defense. Others call it textbook fascism and fatigues. And many, simply don't care. They've inherited the silence, not the scars. Still, the deeper you go into the rural folds of Colombia, the more that silence becomes layered. Because while Carlos is gone, the ghosts of his command structures remain embedded in everyday life. Land ownership maps still reflect the forced displacements of the paramilitary era. Entire swaths of countryside changed hands in the early 2000s, either by threat, coercion, or donation. To this day, attempts to return land to displaced peasants are met with legal delays, violent resistance, or bureaucratic vanishings. Information closest to the victim's side of the story reveals a slow, frustrating truth. Justice is procedural, but trauma is immediate, daily, generational. Families of the disappeared continue gathering under white tents and plazas, holding faded photos beneath banners that read, "Donde están?" Where are they? Some are looking for answers. Others already know, but can't bury what they haven't found. And amid all this, Carlos's name surfaces again. Not because anyone expects him to return, but because his absence is a reminder of how easy it is to erase someone without resolving them. Many people still think that if Carlos had lived longer, he might have testified, might have exposed the full web of power behind the AUC. So what do you think? Did his disappearance preserve the myth or prevent the reckoning? There are reports, unverified, always unverified, that Carlos was preparing a master list. Names, locations, hidden graves, political connections, a final reckoning. Whether that list ever existed remains part of the legend. But many believe that list, not vengeance, was the reason he vanished. In 2007, a documentary filmmaker attempts to trace Carlos's final months. She interviews demobilized fighters, widows, journalists, even former government officials. The final cut, 2 hours long, is a maze of contradictions. One ex-commander claims Carlos was killed by the DEA. Another says he's living on a ranch under a different name. A woman shows the camera a page of a diary, allegedly Carlos's, signed only with a looping C. The documentary ends not with a conclusion, but with a single shot of the fog rolling through an Antiochian valley at dawn. Because that's the thing about Carlos, he can't be summarized. Not neatly, not yet. He was a man who tried to wrap moral language around a war machine, who believed in order, but couldn't control its cost, who sought peace, but through preemptive fire. He was the contradiction Colombia couldn't resolve, because he was born from the very soil that made resolution impossible. And perhaps that's why he still lingers, not as a figure, but as a question mark. Where does justice live when its messenger disappears? What happens to a revolution when its leader walks away from the fire? And can a country truly heal when its wounds are still walking around, voting, buying land, wearing suits? Carlos Castaño Gil may be gone, but in the places where he once ruled, people still lock their doors a little earlier, still whisper when talking politics, still walk a little faster past the old safe houses, because the war ended, technically, but it never really stopped watching. Carlos's legacy doesn't live in bronze or in textbooks. It lives in paperwork, thousands of pages, court transcripts, amnesty petitions, testimonies recorded by flickering microphones in echoing rooms, folders stacked high with the weight of war, but rarely, if ever, resolution. A truth commission can chase facts for decades, but memory doesn't follow protocol. And in Colombia, memory has always been political. In Bogotá, one of the most hotly debated subjects in academic circles is simple. How should history remember Carlos Castaño Gil? Should he be categorized as a war criminal, a revolutionary, a tragic nationalist, a pragmatist? The answers depend on where you're sitting and what ghosts stand behind you. Information closest to the legal record suggests that at the height of the demobilization process, there were serious efforts to prepare an official dossier on Carlos, a document that would codify the timeline of his operations, his decisions, the massacres linked to his command. It was never finished. Too many blank spaces, too many vanished witnesses, too many officials with too much to lose. What emerged instead were fragmented portraits. Confessions from former commanders, naming him as the central intelligence of the AUC. Claims that he not only approved executions, but often designed the blueprints himself. Who to intimidate, who to disappear, when to escalate. Others, notably from lower-ranking fighters, described Carlos as distant, a man they never met, a voice on a radio, a philosophy scribbled in pamphlets. This duality became his armor. He was everywhere, and yet nowhere. The paradox thickens when you listen to his recorded speeches, most of which are now digitized and quietly shared by political science students and curious listeners. His voice is calm, gentle, deceptively paternal. He speaks of democracy, of God, of responsibility. You could mistake him for a professor until you remember the subject matter behind the syllables. In one recording from early 2003, he says, "Colombia cannot be saved by softness. Not anymore. Order must return, even if it walks with a limp." Many people still think that Carlos genuinely believed himself to be a reformer more than a killer. So what do you think? Is belief enough to soften what a man becomes? Even now, survivors of AUC violence wrestle with this contradiction. Some say they believed in Carlos's early vision, before the drug money, before the massacres. Others insist it was always a mask. That ideology was only a convenient veil pulled over the barrel of a gun. There's a courtroom in Medellin where his name comes up regularly. Defense attorneys mention him as the absent architect. Prosecutors describe him as a ghost general. Victims simply call him that man. A victim of the El Aro massacre, one of the most infamous AUC operations, testifies in 2008. She was 17 when paramilitary troops arrived, burned homes, executed suspected guerrilla collaborators, and displaced hundreds. She lost her father and her brother. She remembers the men who did it. She doesn't know their names, but she remembers the white armbands, the discipline, the quiet. "I heard they had a leader," she says. "A man who read books and prayed." I thought, how can someone read books and still send monsters? A silence follows in the room. Outside, on the city walls, graffiti artists paint silhouettes of faceless men under slogans like "Nunca más," never again. Sometimes they write names, other times just question marks. In the countryside, some of the AUC's mass graves are still being uncovered. Local teams with shovels and forensics kits gently brush away the soil, hoping for enough teeth, a ring, a shoe, anything to give a name back to someone lost. Carlos's name often floats over these exhumations like mist, never confirmed, always inferred. There are those who still defend him. Former politicians who say he held the line when the guerrillas were winning. local businessmen who claim he brought security, even a few clergy who argue that Carlos believed in peace, even if he lost his way. But the most honest assessments often come not from officials, but from those who have nothing to gain. A bus driver in Urubá puts it this way: Carlos was like a fire you started to keep warm, but by the time you noticed it had burned the house, it was too late to put it out. And maybe that's the closest we'll get to understanding him, not as a devil, not as a savior, but as a man who struck a match in the dark, then couldn't stop watching what it lit. For those left behind, Carlos Castaño Gil isn't just a memory. They live in the ruins of his calculations. In the years following his disappearance, Colombia begins a long, uneven journey toward national healing. The word reconciliation gets tossed around like confetti in speeches and policy papers, but on the ground, it feels less like closure and more like compromise. Roads are paved over battlefields. Schools rise near mass graves. Tourists return to some towns. Others remain forever paused. And in the midst of it, one question haunts the conversation. What happened to the Castaño family? Carlos's brothers, Fidel and Vicente, are each legends in their own orbit. Fidel, long assumed dead since the mid-1990s, remains a phantom. His body was never recovered. Some say he was killed by guerrillas. Others claim it was a betrayal from within the AUC. Still others believe he faked his death to escape the spiraling violence. His name still appears in court documents, as if time never closed his file. Vicente, on the other hand, faced a more concrete fate. Arrested and imprisoned, he eventually cooperated with some aspects of the government's transitional justice programs. But his testimony, while valuable, never fully cracked open the vault. Too much was redacted. Too much said behind closed doors. Too many secrets buried with his silence. Information closest to post-war accounts reveals that Vicente lived in fear long after his official cooperation. Former commanders resented him. Victims' families wanted more. And in the quiet of his confinement, Vicente reportedly spoke rarely of Carlos, except to say, he was always too careful. I think he knew how it would end. The rest of the Castaño family withdrew from public life. Those who survived changed names, moved abroad, or blended into the cities. The name itself, once so loud, became a whisper in a dozen neighborhoods, still heavy, still avoided. But even without them, the surname lingers in records, in shadows. In 2012, a documentary crew interviewed young people in Medellin and asked them who Carlos Castaño was. A few shrugged. One girl asked, was he a narco? Another guessed, a politician? Only one boy, maybe 15, answered with quiet precision. He was a man who tried to clean Colombia by burning it. It's in this next generation where the story becomes its most dangerous. Half-remembered, romanticized, rebranded. Some social media accounts post quotes attributed to Carlos, often inaccurately, next to black and white portraits. He was a patriot, the captions say. He kept order when no one else would. It's subtle, but it's real. Many people still think that Carlos's memory is being rehabilitated in some circles. So what do you think? Is it nostalgia or selective amnesia? Is it historical distortion or simply fatigue from too many unsolved crimes? One Truth Commission official warns in an op-ed, we must remember him accurately, not flatteringly. Carlos was a man of ideas, but also of massacres. If we forget that second part, we risk inviting the first part back. Still, Colombia's political winds are always shifting. And where there's vacuum, there's ambition. In local elections across former AUC strongholds, candidates with murky affiliations begin appearing on ballots. Campaign slogans invoke themes of security, tradition, sovereignty, words Carlos once used with a chilling kind of precision. Their connection to him is rarely direct, but you can feel it in the rhetoric, a nudge, a callback, a wink to a time when order had a name and boots to enforce it. Meanwhile, former AUC members who demobilized now live quiet lives, some working jobs, others selling fruit or driving taxis. A few speak openly of regret. One former lieutenant, now a parking lot attendant in Cartagena, tells a journalist, "Carlos taught us that fear could be moral." I still don't know if he was right. The journalist asks if he'd follow him again. The man pauses, then says, "Only if I forgot what it cost." That cost is still being tallied, not just in the dead, but in the shape of Colombian society itself, the erosion of civic trust, the normalization of parallel justice, the memory of checkpoints, lists, radio static at midnight. These things linger. They become culture, and yet, for all that Carlos tried to build, for all the speeches and soldiers and symbols, his disappearance remains his most enduring act. A final silence that keeps the country guessing, keeps the system from fully settling. Because if Carlos had been buried, he could be blamed. If he had testified, he could be disarmed. But as a question mark, he's immune, untouchable, frustrating, useful, and that may be the most dangerous version of all. As Colombia drifts forward, never quite healed, never quite broken, the image of Carlos Castaño Gil becomes more spectral than historical. He is a name conjured not in textbooks, but in the quiet discomfort of half-finished conversations. A pause between sentences, a shadow on the edge of an explanation. In 2020, a university symposium titled Leaders of Conflict, Ethics in Civil War features a panel on Carlos. Professors argue over whether he should be classified as a political actor or a war criminal. One scholar refers to him as Colombia's moral insurgent, a man who waged war not out of greed, but out of a distorted sense of duty. Another counters flatly, duty without accountability is just violence in a suit. In the Q&A, a student asks a question that silences the room. If he were alive today, what would we do with him? No one answers, because no one really knows. Information closest to this generation's reckoning shows a sharp divide in how Carlos is perceived by different age groups and regions. For those in cities, especially younger voters born after his disappearance, he's little more than a paragraph in a history class, often squeezed between dates and acronyms that no longer spark fear. But in rural areas, the narrative is more personal. There, people remember him not as a concept, but as an event. A woman in a town once under AUC control keeps a folded flyer in her Bible. It's brittle, yellowed, a paramilitary communique signed by Carlos himself. It warns of curfews, outlines punishments for suspected collaboration with guerrillas, and ends with a blessing from God. "I don't know why I kept it," she says. "Maybe to remind myself that men who speak softly can still tear a world apart." Many people still think that Carlos could have become a legitimate political figure if the war had ended differently. So what do you think? Was he a statesman waiting for the right moment? Or simply a soldier who wore ideology like a uniform? The idea isn't as absurd as it sounds. In the early 2000s, several AUC-aligned candidates were elected to local office. Some even served in Congress before the Parapolitica scandal exposed the web of influence stretching from campaign donations to armed enforcement. Carlos, more articulate and media-savvy than most, may well have entered formal politics had he survived, and had the world let him. There's a chilling thought in that. A man responsible for orchestrating mass violence, potentially giving speeches from a podium, wrapped in democratic protocol. But Colombia, like many nations shaped by internal war, has always struggled to draw hard lines between power and absolution. And maybe that's the true legacy Carlos left behind. Not in blood, not in ink, but in ambiguity. He blurred lines between patriot and warlord, between security and oppression, between justice and revenge. He made it harder to define the enemy, harder to trust the hero, harder to tell when peace was peace and not just a quieter war. There are places where this ambiguity plays out even now. Courtrooms where former AUC commanders claim to be victims of circumstance. Towns where ex-fighters are now elected officials. Schools where teachers skip chapters in the history book because they're not sure how to explain them. Carlos's absence from that history creates both a gap and a shelter. A blank space onto which people project their fears, their regrets, or, most dangerously, their nostalgia. A former AUC commander, now living under a false name in a border town, once told a journalist, "Carlos was the last man who thought he could use war to fix a country. Everyone after him just used it to own one." And maybe that's the difference. Carlos believed in a Colombia that didn't exist, so he tried to build it. But he built with fire, and fire, no matter how precise, always spreads. Some nights, in the hills of Antioquia, old radio channels still crackle faintly with static. Locals say it's just interference from cell towers. Others, half joking, half reverent, say it's Carlos, still sending orders from wherever he ended up, still trying to manage a war that no longer has a name, because wars don't always end. Sometimes they just forget who started them. In the years after his disappearance, Colombia does what it always has when faced with unhealed wounds. It adapts. Not necessarily by solving its past, but by learning how to walk around it. Carlos Castaño Gil becomes a ghost the nation accommodates rather than exorcises. His name fades from headlines, but his influence lingers in invisible policies, reshaped maps, and the vocabulary of state security. The paramilitary era, once explosively visible, slips into abstraction. It's spoken of in passive voice, reduced to terms like the conflict, the violence, or simply what happened. And yet, underneath the bureaucratic language, the real consequences continue unfolding. Former AUC strongholds remain politically unstable. Mayors receive threats if they deviate from unwritten codes. Land restitution cases move at a glacial pace. Victims are forced to testify alongside perpetrators. A woman whose husband was killed in 2002 sees his murderer receive a reduced sentence under the transitional justice framework, and then sees him walking free, 2 towns over. Information closest to the transitional process reveals a staggering imbalance. While thousands of demobilized paramilitaries were promised reintegration support, many received little more than a handshake and a form to sign. Job programs ran out of funding. Psychological services never scaled. Some former fighters turned to crime simply because it paid more than peace. This, too, is Carlos's legacy, an unfinished structure, hastily abandoned by its architect, left to be claimed by anyone with ambition and a gun. Many people still think that Carlos would have supported deeper reforms had he lived. So what do you think? Could the man who designed an army of shadows ever fully step into the light? The Colombian government, for its part, treats his absence like a locked drawer, occasionally opened, quickly shut. His name appears in court filings, peace negotiation retrospectives, and academic footnotes, but never with full clarity. Even state officials who once worked alongside secret channels involving him decline to comment now. One retired interior minister offers a rare off-the-record quote, "Carlos was useful until he wasn't." Perhaps the most vivid reflection of how far his reach once extended comes not in a courtroom or a textbook, but in something quieter, an archive. In Bogotá's National Center for Historical Memory, a researcher stumbles upon a stack of old cassette tapes. They contain intercepted radio conversations from the early 2000s, crackling voices, coded phrases, battlefield coordinates. One tape, marked simply Comandante C, features a calm voice giving orders, followed by a pause and a line that stands out for its dissonance. Remember to tell the villagers that we're here to protect them, then burn the houses. It's not the brutality that chills, it's the casualness, the cadence of someone who believes deeply in what they're doing, even when it breaks everything. Carlos Castaño never saw the post-conflict era, never testified, never stood trial, but in many ways, he still presides over it. His decisions echo in land disputes, in corrupted town councils, in the quiet normalization of shadow governance. His image, whether vilified or venerated, remains a placeholder for every unsolved contradiction in the country's reconciliation process. There's a mural in Medellin that used to depict him, back when conversations about peace were still raw and brave. It was painted over 3 times. The final time, no new art replaced it, just blank concrete. A local activist said that felt more honest. You can't paint over ghosts. They bleed through. Colombia is filled with such ghosts, not just Carlos, but the world he helped create. A world where peace feels negotiable, where justice requires careful choreography, and where truth is less a destination than a minefield. And yet, there are flickers. New generations of teachers include the AUC period in their syllabi. Community centers hold memory circles. Survivors speak not with rage, but with calm resolve. And in some villages, people begin reclaiming land once lost to fear. Carlos's name rarely comes up in these moments, not directly, but you can sense his legacy in the room, the way people talk around certain topics, the way they brace themselves before saying, "Back when the men came." He left behind no grave, no final letter, no signature on a peace treaty, only a pause, a silence shaped like a man, a future shaped by a past that still won't sit still. The deeper Colombia moves into its post-conflict identity, the more complicated Carlos Castaño Gil becomes, not just as a historical figure, but as a psychological anchor. He's not remembered so much as revisited, like a familiar dream that lingers too long after waking. For every conversation that dares to dissect him, there are 10 that avoid his name entirely. And yet, he's everywhere, in the architecture of paramilitary successor groups, in legal reforms designed to limit militia power, in the persistent discomfort that settles in any room where truth and justice are discussed side by side. Colombian literature begins to reflect this tension. In novels, Carlos becomes a character never directly named, but unmistakably present. The cold commander, the principled killer, the vanished ghost. Playwrights stage dramas about disappearances, about moral ambiguity, about young men corrupted by ideology dressed as discipline. Even television, long dominated by narco-glorification, begins flirting with the more unsettling story. What happens when a killer believes he's righteous? Information closest to the cultural pulse reveals a quiet renaissance of reflection. Universities expand their conflict studies departments. Podcasts dissect paramilitary psychology. Former fighters publish memoirs, some raw and self-indulgent, others painfully honest. In these accounts, Carlos is rarely the villain. More often, he's the compass, the man who gave them a story to follow, whether or not it was ever true. Many people still think that Carlos's intellectualism set him apart, that if he had written essays instead of battle orders, he'd be teaching political science. So what do you think? Was he a philosopher of war or simply a tactician with a book collection? This idea that intelligence can excuse violence is part of the problem. It's easier to romanticize a man who quoted Latin than it is to reckon with the bodies he left behind. But as the years pass, that reckoning becomes harder to avoid. In 2021, a regional truth commission releases an exhaustive report detailing AUC operations in the Northwestern Corridor. It names names, dates, locations. Entire chapters are devoted to the Castaño Doctrine, a blend of counterinsurgency strategy, territorial control, and moral justification. The report pulls no punches. Carlos Castaño Gil used the language of justice to normalize execution. He used the rhetoric of order to cultivate fear. But even as it condemns him, the report cannot resist complexity. It acknowledges his efforts to negotiate peace, his frustrations with corruption, his rare attempts to protect civilians in specific operations. The conclusion is haunting in its neutrality. He believed he was saving Colombia. He did not save it, but neither did those who replaced him. In remote villages, survivors of AUC violence attend community healing programs. Some speak openly for the first time. A woman recounts how her son, accused of helping guerrillas, was taken by Carlos's men and never seen again. She doesn't cry when she tells the story. She just says, "I kept expecting someone to knock on the door and explain. No one ever came." Another man, formerly AUC, now demobilized, sits in the same circle. He says nothing for most of the session. Then he says, "Carlos told us that if we were disciplined, we'd be remembered as patriots." He pauses. "We weren't. We were feared. And then we were forgotten." There's no reply, just nods and silence, because at some point, the story stops being about Carlos and starts being about the people he shaped, the trauma he routed through their lives, the choices they made in his shadow. In Medellin, a teacher introduces a new assignment. Write a letter to someone in the conflict, a victim, a perpetrator, a ghost. One student writes a letter to Carlos. She begins with, "You never met me, but I lived inside the war you built. So now I want to ask, when you prayed at night, did you ever say my name without knowing it?" She never sends it. It's pinned on a corkboard in the back of the classroom. Carlos Castaño Gil may be untraceable by satellite or search party, but his coordinates are still mapped in the way people speak, remember, and try to forget. His presence remains ambient, like humidity, never visible, always felt. And as Colombia stumbles toward healing, there's no real blueprint, just fragments, just names, just stories with no proper ending. But in those stories, his silhouette remains, slightly blurred, slightly distorted, still walking ahead in the fog. In a country with more ghosts than plaques, it's the silences that tell the truth. Carlos Castaño Gil is never formally honored, never legally convicted, never definitively mourned. He hovers, untethered, too useful to forget, too dangerous to glorify. And for many Colombians, that's precisely where they prefer him. Unspoken, ambiguous, unresolved. But even silence can't hold indefinitely. By the mid-2020s, Colombia's new generation begins to circle back to the past, not through monuments or tribunals, but through questions. Teenagers ask their grandparents what it was like during the years of the uniforms. University essays dissect Carlos's language. Podcasts explore how a man who once quoted St. Augustine could order the destruction of an entire village by radio. And in that circling, something changes. Carlos is no longer just a figure from the past. He becomes a lens through which Colombia studies itself. A young historian in Bogota, working through declassified archives and redacted field reports, proposes a controversial thesis. Carlos Castaño was not a man corrupted by war, but a man who thought he could civilize it. Her peers push back. Civilize? He armed thousands, ordered executions, manipulated state institutions. Yes, she replies, but he wrote essays about it. Information closest to the modern academic narrative suggests this re-examination is part of a broader movement to understand how Colombia's wars have always blended violence with vocabulary. Carlos didn't invent this pattern, but he perfected it. And perhaps that's why he still matters. Many people still think that Carlos's rhetorical sophistication shielded him from moral accountability. So what do you think? Can eloquence in the service of atrocity ever be anything but a mask? This debate spills into art galleries, theater productions, even street murals. One installation in Cali displays two identical busts, one labeled Patriot, the other Terrorist. Visitors are invited to place post-it notes beneath each. Over time, the colors blend. The words repeat. Both. Neither. Depends. In a coastal town where an AUC unit once operated, survivors gather for an oral history project. One woman, now in her 60s, speaks softly into a microphone. When Carlos's men were here, the curfew was 6 p.m. My husband worked late. One night, he didn't come home. They said he had been seen talking to someone with a beard. That was enough. They never returned his body, only his shoes. She looks down. I used to think if I met Carlos, I would ask why. Now I just want him to know he didn't win. But did he? That question haunts Colombia more than Carlos himself ever did. Because while his disappearance marked the end of his physical story, it also spared him the erosion of reputation that time brings. No trial, no humiliating photo in cuffs, no final desperate plea for forgiveness. Just a vanishing act, perfectly timed, disturbingly cinematic. In the hills of Antioquia, the rumor of his survival persists. Occasionally, villagers claim to have seen him. A man with his posture, his walk, always older, always alone. These sightings rarely last longer than the retelling, but they serve a purpose. They keep him from becoming too abstract. They tether him to the soil, even if fictionally. One ex-paramilitary fighter, now reformed and working as a local mediator, puts it this way: Carlos isn't dead. He's dormant, in every place that prefers order over justice, in every law that punishes truth-telling, in every silence we maintain because the truth might be too expensive. And there it is. His legacy isn't in ideology, not anymore. It's in habit. The habit of looking away, of speaking carefully, of assuming some things are better left buried. Carlos didn't invent Colombia's violence. He inherited it. But he gave it language, logistics, and, most dangerously, morality. He made it palatable, professional, sharpened. And though his army dissolved and his voice was silenced, that sharpening remains. A farmer in the Monte de Maria puts it simply: I don't know what happened to the man. I only know what happened after he left, and that's worse. So as Colombia moves into new elections, new policies, new peace processes, the question returns, not about where Carlos is, but whether the country he dreamed of still exists in some mutated form, a country that values silence over justice, control over truth. And if it does, then Carlos Castaño Gil never really left. He just put down the radio and let others carry the frequency. By now, Carlos Castaño Gil is more ghost than man, more echo than biography. He exists in fragments, disjointed quotes, conflicting testimonies, forgotten coordinates, and glances over shoulders that last too long. No photo captures his final years. No voice recording survives beyond 2003. His last verified footprint in Colombia's red soil is more than 2 decades old. And yet, the prince never really stopped. The justice system still tangles with the knots he tied. Ongoing trials cite his name. Investigations about collusion between paramilitaries and politicians, known as parapolitica, continue to unspool into the present day. Each new confession from a demobilized fighter adds another pin on the map. Another body, another betrayal, another order traced back to him, even when the voice that gave it is long silent. Information closest to the legal archives shows that prosecutors still debate whether to list Carlos as a suspect, a witness, or a missing link. In the spreadsheets of transitional justice, he occupies all 3 columns. A former state investigator, now retired, reflects in an interview. He was always 2 steps ahead. Even now, we're still reading notes he wrote before he disappeared. And while the court strained to piece together a full profile, culture has done what courts could not. It has mythologized him. In 2023, a best-selling novel features a character modeled loosely after Carlos, a revolutionary turned warlord whose final message is broadcast as a pre-recorded confession that triggers civil unrest. The novel sells 500,000 copies. A Netflix adaptation follows. Viewers debate whether the character is a villain, a martyr, or something worse. Someone who truly believed he was right. Many people still think that Carlos was writing a memoir before he vanished. So what do you think? Would the man who built a militia from grief ever lay himself bare on the page? Or was his final act of silence the most strategic chapter of all? Elsewhere, his name is resurrected more cynically. Political candidates from fringe right-wing parties sometimes cite him as a man who did what needed doing. They don't say his name outright, but phrases like restoring order, taking back the countryside, or fighting chaos with discipline draw the same lines without ink. In regions still grappling with criminal gangs that rose from AUC ashes, some locals speak of Carlos with weary resignation. They say things like, "At least back then there were rules," or, "When he was in charge, things didn't feel random." But those memories are often trauma disguised as nostalgia, because under Carlos, the order was enforced with fear. The peace came with price tags. The rules were written in secret and broken in blood. And the worst part? Many people accepted it because the alternative felt worse. So what happens when that model becomes normalized? You get quiet towns with invisible warlords, elected officials with armored SUVs and no declared donors, judges who recuse themselves not for conflict of interest, but out of fear, and a country where the word paramilitarism no longer shocks. It simply lands like humidity, heavy, familiar, expected. In that climate, Carlos thrives, not in body, but in template, because for every generation that tries to understand him, another quietly mimics the architecture he left behind. The checkpoints with no insignia, the schools repurposed for interrogation. The idea that if you call a war defense, you don't have to admit it's a war at all. One journalist summarizes it best. Colombia didn't get rid of Carlos Castaño, it absorbed him. And yet, in the midst of that absorption, resistance stirs. Victims' collectives gather each year in April, marking the date of his disappearance. Not to mourn him, but to remember those whose fates were bound to his. They walk silently through town squares. Some hold photos. Others carry signs with a single phrase, El Sabía. He knew. In Bogotá, a museum dedicated to memory and truth opens a new wing. This one dedicated entirely to paramilitary structures. the curators choose not to display Carlos's photo. Instead, they place a single quote from one of his own communiques on the wall. History will judge our methods, but not our reasons. Beneath it, someone has scrawled in pen, "History is judging both." As Colombia edges toward what it hopes is a lasting peace, Carlos remains its unfinished paragraph. Not a period, not a question mark, but a comma, the kind that drags the sentence forward, hesitating, unsure if it's ready to move on. Carlos Castaño Gil ends as he lived, half seen, half believed. Somewhere between patriotism and terror, between doctrine and disappearance. His life was a story in fragments, his legacy a slow-burning fuse that still smolders beneath Colombia's surface. No conclusive ending ever came, just absence, an echo without walls, a silence with teeth. Today, in the minds of those who remember him, or inherited his consequences, Carlos exists less as a man and more as a method. A kind of logic passed down like a tool, sharpened discipline, calibrated fear, and the belief that violence can be shaped into something moral if you speak gently enough. In neighborhoods once under AUC control, kids now run through streets their parents used to avoid after sunset. The guns are fewer, the flags are gone, but the boundaries still exist, in glances, in silences, in who's allowed to ask questions and who isn't. The terrain may be quieter now, but it's still coded. A radio program in Medellin once asked its listeners to describe Carlos Castaño in one word. The most common answer wasn't killer or leader. It was complicated. Information closest to collective reconciliation shows that the final verdict on Carlos will likely never be unanimous. The archives will grow. The interviews will multiply. His myth will evolve with the nation's own memory of itself. Many people still think that Colombia isn't ready to confront everything Carlos represents. So what do you think? Should a country dig up every ghost, or let some remain unnamed to avoid waking worse ones? Because Carlos's genius, if it can be called that, wasn't just military. It was narrative. He told a version of the story that many people wanted to believe, that there was a clean way to end a dirty war, that brutality could be organized, that if you quoted scripture while issuing orders, maybe you weren't the villain. But war doesn't offer neat resolutions, only scars, some seen, some buried. And so we reach the end of the trail, not with answers, but with the echoes of a man who once believed that he could draw maps with blood and call them borders, that he could write commandments while erasing names, that he could disappear and still be present in every unspoken fear. The map is quieter now, but if you stand in the right part of Antioquia and listen closely between the drone of insects and the far-off hum of motorcycles, you might still hear him, not speaking, just watching, not walking, just waiting. Because history, like Carlos Castaño Gil, sometimes refuses to stay buried. Let's slow everything down now. Let the noise drift away, like the last crackle of a faraway radio signal, fading into static, then nothing. You've followed a long, heavy trail tonight, through hills and jungles, through politics and ghosts, through a story with no clean heroes and no safe conclusions. Take a breath. Carlos Castaño's world was one of sharp lines he drew between us and them, loyal and traitor, peace and war. But those lines, like footsteps in soft earth, fade with time, and now they're just impressions, shadows, silence folded into the fabric of a country still finding its voice. Wherever you are, whether under the soft hum of a fan or with the quiet of night pressing gently on your windows, just remember, the past does not reach for you here. It stays where it belongs, tucked behind the veil of memory, unable to touch your present breath. Let your shoulders fall. Let the weight of history slip from your chest. The jungle is still now. The story has stopped pacing. You're safe. Let the rhythm of your own heartbeat replace the sound of marching boots. Let the quiet become not absence, but comfort. And as your eyes begin to close, carry with you this last thought. Sometimes, the bravest thing a country, or a person, can do is to look at its darkest corners and still choose to rest. Because rest is its own kind of resistance. Good night, traveler of difficult stories. Sleep well.